Real nightmares. The train hissed as it pulled into the station, its brakes screeching through the quiet night. Jacob boarded it like he did every night, tired, detached, and weighed down by the monotony of another long day at work. His worn leather briefcase brushed against the seats as he made his way to his usual spot by the window. The familiar jolt of the train setting off was oddly comforting, a reminder that, for all its dreariness, at least some things in his life stayed the same. He settled into his seat and stared out at the blurry landscape slipping by. The dim, flickering lights inside the carriage cast long, trembling shadows, distorting the shapes of the empty seats around him. There were only a few other passengers scattered throughout the car, their faces half hidden behind newspapers or phones. Jacob couldn't see them clearly, but it didn't matter. He had become accustomed to ignoring the world around him. Ever since, well, it was easier to disconnect. He sighed and opened the novel he had been trying to read for weeks. The words blurred together almost as quickly as the view outside, but he forced himself to focus. The story was some crime thriller, fast-paced, sharp, but it failed to hold his attention. His mind kept wandering back to thoughts he preferred not to entertain. The silence of the train, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks, had a way of luring him into those dark corners of his mind. Then came a flicker. The lights overhead buzzed and dimmed briefly, casting the carriage into an unsettling half-darkness. Jacob looked up from his book, his eyes catching a strange reflection in the window. It was subtle, but for a fleeting moment, it seemed like there was someone sitting in the seat across from him, their outline vague and distorted in the dim light. He blinked and glanced around the carriage. There was no one there, just empty rows of seats and the soft hum of the train. Jacob frowned, his pulse quickening slightly, but he quickly shook off the feeling. It was probably just a trick of the light or his tired eyes playing games with him. After all, it had been a long day. Too long. He turned back to his book, trying to lose himself in the fictional world. The train sped onward, deeper into the night. The outside world now nothing more than a blur of dark shapes and distant lights. But despite his best efforts, Jacob couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. There was an unease lingering in the air, something he couldn't put his finger on. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, hoping the steady hum of the train would lull him into some semblance of peace. As he did, the feeling of being watched crept in again, like a presence just out of sight. His eyes snapped open, but the seat across from him remained empty, as it always had been. Jacob let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, trying to convince himself it was nothing more than exhaustion getting the best of him. But somewhere, deep down, the train didn't feel as familiar as it had before. There was something different about tonight's ride, something he couldn't quite explain. The train rattled forward into the dark, and Jacob once again tried to immerse himself in the book, though his mind was already somewhere else, somewhere darker, just outside his conscious grasp. The train rattled on, and after what felt like an eternity, it began to slow as it approached the next station. Jacob glanced out the window, catching glimpses of the empty platform, bathed in weak, fluorescent light. The train came to a halt with a familiar hiss, and the doors slid open with a mechanical clunk. For a moment, it seemed as if no one would board. The platform remained eerily still, devoid of life. Then, just as Jacob was about to turn back to his book, a figure stepped into the carriage. A woman, her movements unervingly slow, entered and walked down the aisle. Jacob felt an instinctive chill run through him. She took a seat directly across from him. It was strange. The rest of the carriage was nearly empty, yet she had chosen the one spot closest to him. Her presence unsettled him immediately. She was dressed in a drab, old-fashioned coat, the kind you might see in black and white photos from decades ago. Her hair, tied back in a severe bun, and her pale skin made her look almost ghost-like in the dim lighting. Jacob looked down at his book, trying not to stare, but he couldn't help himself. He stole quick glances at her between paragraphs, growing increasingly uneasy. She sat rigid, her posture unnaturally stiff, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was expressionless, her eyes vacant, as if she were lost in some deep, unreachable place. What disturbed Jacob the most, though, was the overwhelming feeling that he had seen her before. But where? He couldn't place her. Perhaps she resembled someone from a distant memory, or maybe she was simply a manifestation of his fraying nerves. Whatever the reason, her presence gnawed at him. He tried to return his focus to the book, but the words were no longer sticking. Every time he glanced up, the woman was still there, motionless, staring blankly ahead. As the train picked up speed again, Jacob became hyper-aware of the strange silence that had descended upon the carriage. The usual hum of chatter, even the occasional cough or shuffle of feet, was absent. He could hear only the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks, and beneath it, a faint buzzing sound. It almost sounded like whispers, but too soft and indistinct to make out. The tension tightened in his chest. He fought the growing urge to speak, to break the silence and ask the woman something, anything. Why did she sit there, of all places? Did she know him? But as quickly as the thought surfaced, he dismissed it. What would he even say? He didn't want to come off as paranoid or worse, crazy. The train lurched, swaying slightly as it cut through the darkness outside. Jacob's eyes darted from the book to the woman again. She hadn't moved an inch. Her unnatural stillness was starting to become unbearable. His heart skipped a beat when she finally moved. It was subtle, a slight turn of her head. Her eyes, dull and lifeless, seemed to flicker with the train's dim lights as they locked with his. Jacob froze, the blood draining from his face. There was something wrong with her gaze. It wasn't the gaze of a normal person. It felt empty, like staring into a hollow shell. And then, without warning, she turned her head back toward the window, her eyes staring blankly into the night again, as if nothing had happened. Jacob shuddered, gripping the edges of his seat. What had just happened? Had he imagined the whole thing? Maybe he was letting his imagination get the better of him. He rubbed his eyes and tried to focus on his breathing. Everything was fine. It was just another night, another train ride. But as the carriage rattled along the tracks, the whispers, the faint buzzing sound, grew louder, almost like static. And it seemed to be coming from the woman's direction. He strained to listen, but the sound was too garbled to make sense. Yet it was there, persistent and unnerving, drilling into his skull with every passing second. Jacob turned his gaze back to the window, watching the darkness outside blur by. The train hurtled deeper into the night, carrying him further away from everything familiar. And though he tried to shake off the feeling, the thought persisted. Something wasn't right. Jacob sat rigid, forcing himself to concentrate on the steady rhythm of the train, trying to push away the mounting dread. His eyes remained glued to the pages of his book, though he was no longer reading. The tension in the carriage was suffocating, and that strange woman's presence across from him felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. The train slowed as it approached the next station, and Jacob felt a glimmer of relief. Maybe she would get off. He glanced out the window, hoping to see a bustling platform that might draw her away. But the platform was empty, just as the last one had been. No movement, no sound. Only the flickering station lights casting long, eerie shadows across the concrete. The train came to a halt. For a moment, it was deathly quiet. Then, with a soft shuffle, a new passenger stepped aboard. Jacob watched as an older man, his face obscured by the brim of a worn hat, made his way down the aisle. The man sat a few rows ahead, facing the front of the train, his back to Jacob. His arrival should have been a relief, another person, another reminder that this was just a normal train ride. But something about him was unsettling too. Jacob tried to focus on his book again, willing the story to pull him away from this growing sense of unease. Yet, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed more movement. Two women boarded at the next stop, dressed in similarly outdated clothing, and sat a few seats behind the first man. As the train continued, more passengers filtered in, one by one, each taking their place in the otherwise empty car. It was as if they were trickling in from some forgotten era, people who didn't quite fit into the present. He felt a tightening in his chest as he scanned their faces. They all sat in silence, unnaturally still, much like the woman across from him. Jacob tried to convince himself that he was overthinking it. After all, people ride the train in silence all the time. But these passengers felt wrong. There was something about their vacant expressions and stiff movements that gnawed at him. And then it hit him. One of the men, sitting near the front, looked disturbingly familiar. He was older now, with deeper lines etched into his face, but there was no mistaking it. It was his childhood friend, Alex. The same Alex who had died in a car accident when they were teenagers. Jacob's stomach dropped as the recognition sunk in. It couldn't be him. It was impossible. A cold sweat broke out across Jacob's forehead. He tried to focus on the details, searching for something that might prove he was mistaken. But there was no denying it. Alex's expression was vacant, his eyes glassy and distant, as if he were simply there, not truly alive. Jacob's hands trembled as he clutched the edge of his seat. He quickly scanned the other passengers, his breath hitching in his throat. There, 2 rows back, sat another figure. An older woman with graying hair, slumped slightly against the window. His heart skipped a beat. She looked like his old neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, who had passed away years ago. And just behind her was a man in a faded jacket who resembled his coworker Paul, who had died of a heart attack last winter. Jacob's pulse quickened. How could this be? His mind scrambled for an explanation, but the train rattled on, indifferent to his growing panic. It was as if the past had somehow climbed aboard, taking up seats in this otherwise empty carriage, staring vacantly ahead, neither here nor gone. The whispers returned, barely audible yet persistent, like a broken radio signal creeping into the corners of his consciousness. He glanced again at the woman across from him. She remained motionless, her eyes still locked on the darkness outside the window. The whispers seemed to swirl around her, but they were now louder, more distinct. He could almost make out words, though they eluded full comprehension. Jacob's mind reeled as he tried to make sense of the situation. These people, these passengers, they couldn't be real. They were ghosts from his past, people who had left this world years ago. He closed his eyes, hoping to reset his thoughts, to dispel the rising terror that threatened to swallow him whole. When he opened them again, they were all still there, silent, still, watching. Jacob felt trapped, suffocated by the mounting impossibility of it all. His breaths came quicker now, shallow and ragged. He wanted to get up, to walk down the aisle, to ask these figures what they were doing here, what they wanted from him. But he couldn't move. His legs felt leaden, as if the weight of the realization had physically rooted him to his seat. There was no escape. Not yet. Jacob's mind raced as the train rattled deeper into the night. He tried to focus on the rhythmic clatter of the tracks beneath him, hoping the repetitive noise would drown out the growing fear clawing at his insides. But the passengers, their presence was too overwhelming. The eerie familiarity of their faces, the way they stared ahead, unmoving, filled the air with a suffocating sense of dread. He couldn't take it any longer. At the next stop, he resolved, he would get off. It didn't matter where the train was, or how far he'd be from home. He needed to escape this nightmare. The train began to slow, and Jacob felt a fleeting sense of hope. The lights of the station grew nearer, casting pale yellow glows through the windows, revealing nothing but the desolate platform outside. It was empty, just like the previous stops. Jacob stood as the train came to a halt. He grabbed his briefcase, his hands trembling as he clutched it tightly. The train's doors slid open with their usual hiss, and he made his way toward them, determined to leave. But they didn't move. Jacob stood inches away, staring at the doors, his heart pounding. The cold metal remained firmly shut, sealing him inside. He pressed the button repeatedly, but it refused to respond. The mechanism hummed softly, like a machine long out of service. His breath quickened as panic swelled in his chest. He looked around, hoping to see a conductor or another passenger heading toward the exit. But the passengers remained in their seats, staring into space, completely uninterested in his struggle. None of them moved. None of them even acknowledged him. "Hello?" Jacob called out, his voice thin and strained. "Can anyone help?" No response. His eyes flicked back to the door, and he began pounding on it, desperate to force it open. But it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. Panic flooded through him, sharp and suffocating. He stepped back from the door, his hands shaking. The station platform outside was still, the lights flickering dimly, casting long shadows that reached for him through the glass. Suddenly, the train lurched forward, throwing Jacob off balance. It rattled back into motion, accelerating down the track. He stumbled, catching himself against the nearest seat. The station was gone, swallowed by the darkness outside. His breath came in shallow gasps. What was happening? Why couldn't he leave? Jacob staggered back to his seat, his mind spinning with possibilities. Was he dreaming? Was this some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But everything felt too real. The cold metal of the doors, the unyielding resistance, the low hum of the train's engine. This wasn't a dream. The passengers remained as they were, silent, still, their faces a mix of the living and the dead. The whispers returned, more insistent now, the garbled words seeming to burrow into his mind. He could almost make out their meaning, but they remained just beyond his grasp. His thoughts turned to escape again. If he couldn't leave through the doors, maybe he could find another way out. His eyes darted around the carriage, looking for emergency exits or windows that might open. But everything appeared sealed, locked tight as though the train was a steel tomb hurtling through the night. He stood up again, resolved to explore the rest of the train. Maybe another car had an exit, or perhaps someone else, a conductor, or even another living passenger, could help. Anything was better than sitting there, waiting for whatever was coming next. Jacob walked down the aisle, past the rows of still, lifeless passengers. Their faces blurred in his periphery, but every now and then, he caught flashes of recognition. Faces from his past. Faces of the dead. He tried not to look too closely. As he passed the woman who had first unsettled him, he felt a sharp chill. Her eyes were still fixed on the window, but her lips twitched ever so slightly, as if she was whispering something. The sound was barely audible, but it cut through the soft hum of the train like a knife. Jacob quickened his pace, moving toward the next car. As he opened the door connecting the carriages, a gust of cold air blew through, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. His stomach turned, but he pressed on, desperate for answers. He stepped into the next car, but his heart sank. It was identical to the one he had just left. Same dim lighting, same old-fashioned seats, and worse, more passengers. They filled the seats just as the others had, their expressions vacant, their presence oppressive. Jacob's steps faltered as he realized something horrible. He recognized these people, too. Somewhere, deep inside, he knew what was coming. But the truth was too terrifying to fully accept. He staggered back, retreating into the previous car, his heart hammering in his chest. The realization began to gnaw at him, sinking in with relentless certainty. There was no getting off this train. Jacob slumped back into his seat, his body trembling with a cold sweat. His thoughts spiraled as the train hurtled into the unknown, deeper into the darkness. The realization weighed on him like an anchor. There was no way off this train, no exit, no escape. Only the passengers, sitting like silent shadows, their faces frozen in blank, eerie expressions. He pressed his hands to his face, trying to calm his racing heart. But the whispers had grown louder now, buzzing at the edges of his mind, refusing to be ignored. His mind darted from one thought to the next, seeking some kind of rational explanation. Maybe he was dreaming, trapped in some nightmare. Maybe it was exhaustion, or worse, his mind breaking down under the weight of grief and stress. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, one unsettling truth kept gnawing at him. The faces he had seen. Alex, Mrs. Holloway, Paul, all dead, all sitting here on this train with him. And now, he was surrounded by more of them, all familiar, all long gone. He glanced over at the woman still seated across from him. Her pale, lifeless face hadn't changed, her empty gaze fixed on the passing blur of darkness outside. It was as if she were waiting for something. Jacob's fingers clenched into fists as frustration and fear twisted inside him. He had to know what was happening. He had to ask. Summoning what little courage he had left, he leaned forward slightly, his voice a shaky whisper. "Who are you?" The woman didn't respond. Her lips remained still, but the faint whispering sound grew louder, filling the air around him. It wasn't coming from her. It was coming from everywhere. an insistent murmur that seemed to vibrate from the walls of the train itself. "Who are you?" Jacob repeated, louder this time, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. "What is this place?" The woman's head slowly turned, her eyes locking onto his with a cold, vacant stare. The movement was so slow and deliberate that it sent a fresh wave of chills down Jacob's spine. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time, she spoke. "You already know." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, and barely more than a whisper. Yet the words struck Jacob with the force of a hammer. He recoiled slightly, his mind racing to comprehend what she meant. "I don't know," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't understand." The woman's gaze remained fixed on him, unblinking, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she said nothing more, and Jacob felt the rising tension between them like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft but chilling. "You do." Jacob shook his head, fear surging through him. "No, I don't. I don't know anything." The train rumbled beneath them, its endless journey through the darkness steady and unrelenting. The woman didn't answer this time. She simply turned her head back toward the window, as if the conversation were over. The whispers continued to fill the air, gnawing at the edges of Jacob's sanity. Desperate for answers, he stood up, his legs shaking as he approached the older man sitting a few rows ahead. The man who looked so much like his old friend, Alex. The closer Jacob got, the more certain he became. It was Alex. The same round face, the same short brown hair that had started to gray around the edges. His clothes were outdated, almost as if they hadn't changed since the day of his funeral. Jacob's voice cracked as he leaned toward the man. "Alex." The man didn't react, didn't turn. He stared ahead, just as lifeless as the others. Jacob reached out with trembling fingers, placing a hand on Alex's shoulder, hoping for some response, any sign of recognition. "Alex, do you hear me?" For a moment, there was nothing. The man remained still, a statue frozen in place. Then, slowly, his head turned, and his eyes met Jacob's. But there was no warmth, no spark of life in them. Alex's eyes were dull, almost hollow, and his lips barely moved as he spoke. "You're one of us now." Jacob staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind fought against the meaning of those words. He couldn't be one of them. He wasn't dead. He was alive, sitting on this train, trying to get home. This wasn't possible. "No," Jacob muttered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No, I'm not dead. This isn't real. This is some kind of—" But the words died in his throat as Alex's face twisted into something darker, an expression of grim finality. "You've been dead for some time, Jacob." The sentence crashed into Jacob like a tidal wave, threatening to pull him under. He staggered back to his seat, his mind reeling, his body numb. He wanted to scream, to deny it, but deep down, something inside him recognized the truth. The strange familiarity of the passengers, the unsettling feeling of being watched, the whispers in the walls. It had all been leading to this moment. He was dead, and this train wasn't just a ride home. It was something else entirely, a journey into the afterlife, a purgatory where he was stuck, surrounded by the souls of those who had died before him, those he had forgotten, ignored, or lost over the years. And now he was one of them, destined to ride this endless train into the darkness. Jacob's chest tightened, a sob escaping his throat. How had he not known? How had he not realized that he had left the world behind? The memories flashed through his mind, of days blending together, of grief, of moments he had tried so hard to forget. And now, here he was, trapped on this endless ride, with no way to escape. He buried his face in his hands, his mind unraveling with the horrifying truth. Jacob's world collapsed around him, the truth sinking its claws deep into his mind. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. His body remained frozen in place, a mere husk of what he had once been. His hands trembled in his lap as his breath quickened, coming in short, panicked gasps. The voices of the passengers, people he had known, people who had died, filled his ears like a constant, gnawing presence. "You've been dead for some time, Jacob." Alex's words echoed in his head, reverberating off the walls of his consciousness, impossible to shake. How could this be real? How could he be dead? His thoughts churned violently as he tried to grasp at any sense of normalcy, but the train kept moving, unrelenting, driving deeper into the darkness that now seemed endless. He forced himself to breathe, his fingers clutching the armrests as if they could anchor him to something real. But reality was slipping away, dissolving around him like smoke. His mind screamed for an answer, for an explanation that made sense, but none came. The whispers continued, pressing against his skull, buzzing in his ears. They were louder now, insistent and invasive. "You're dead," they whispered. "You're dead. You're one of us now." Jacob bolted up from his seat, unable to sit still any longer. His legs felt weak, like they might give out beneath him, but he forced them to move. He stumbled down the aisle, past the rows of passengers who watched him with their vacant, hollow eyes. Some of them murmured as he passed, their whispers merging into a chorus of incoherent voices. He needed to find a way out. His feet carried him toward the back of the train, even though deep down, he knew it was pointless. Still, he had to try. His pulse raced as he opened the door to the next car, expecting, hoping, something would be different. But it wasn't. The next car was the same as the last. More passengers filled the seats, their faces familiar and haunting, just like the ones he had already seen. His heart clenched as he recognized a few more. Old neighbors, co-workers from years ago, people he hadn't thought about in ages. Their stares were blank, their postures rigid, as though time had stopped for them. Jacob stumbled backward, his mind unraveling further with every passing second. He couldn't escape. The realization bore down on him, heavy and suffocating. Every door led to another car filled with more ghosts of his past, each one silently waiting, as though they had been expecting him all along. The air in the train grew thick, the temperature dropping. It felt colder than before, the icy chill seeping into Jacob's bones. He pressed forward, trying to outrun the horror that clawed at his mind, but his legs grew heavier with each step, as if the train itself were swallowing him whole. His breathing became labored as he entered yet another identical car. The passengers here were worse, grotesque, their features decayed and distorted, their flesh sagging and gray. They weren't just people he had known in life. They were memories of people he had wronged, people he had let down, faces twisted with anger, pain, and despair. The weight of their disappointment settled on him like a crushing wave. "Please," Jacob gasped, turning around to flee. "I just want to go home." But the train was home now. There was no escape. The lights in the carriage flickered, dimming as the train jolted violently, throwing Jacob off balance. He fell to the floor, his hands scraping against the cold, hard surface. For a moment, the whispers faded, replaced by an unbearable silence. Jacob tried to stand, but his body felt heavy, his muscles weak and unresponsive. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and his breath hitched in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head. Standing in the aisle, barely a foot away, was a figure, tall, looming, its face a blur of shadow and shifting features. It seemed to pulse with the flickering lights, like it wasn't fully part of this world. Its form rippled, twisting as if it was constantly on the verge of dissolving into nothingness. Jacob scrambled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure didn't move, but it watched him with an intensity that sent chills crawling down his spine. "Why?" Jacob choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Why am I here?" The figure remained silent for a moment, the air around it buzzing with an unnatural hum. Then, its head tilted slightly, and a voice, soft, almost tender, whispered from the shadows. "You already know." The words echoed through him like a death knell, the same phrase the woman had spoken earlier. Jacob shook his head violently, denial surging through him like a wave. He didn't know. He couldn't know. The figure's form flickered again, and the whispers returned, louder this time, more urgent, a cacophony of voices that tore at Jacob's sanity. "You already know. You already know." Jacob screamed, his hands clutching his head as he tried to drown out the noise. His vision blurred, and the world around him spun. He staggered back, his body collapsing against the seat behind him. The train shuddered violently, and the air around him grew colder still. Suddenly, everything stopped. The lights, the whispers, the rattling of the train. All fell into an eerie silence. Jacob opened his eyes, his heart still pounding in his chest, and found himself alone again. The figure was gone, and the passengers sat in their seats, as still as statues. But something had changed. Jacob looked out the window, his breath catching in his throat. The train was no longer speeding through an endless night. Instead, it had slowed, passing through a small, familiar town. The streets were lined with houses he recognized, the same houses he had grown up around. And there, standing on the platform, was a funeral. His funeral. Jacob stared out the window, his breath catching in his throat as the scene unfolded. A small crowd had gathered on the platform, dressed in dark clothes, their faces solemn and familiar. He could make out every detail: the soft flutter of a black veil, the glint of a polished casket, the dull murmur of mourners paying their respects. It was his funeral. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the crowd. His family was there, standing in a tight group near the front. His mother, his father, and his brother, all huddled together in grief. His closest friends stood nearby, faces pale and drawn with sorrow. Even his co-workers had come, their eyes red from holding back tears. They had gathered to say goodbye, to mourn the man who had been lost. But Jacob wasn't lost. He was right here. He was alive, or so he had thought. The train slowed as it passed by, giving him a full view of the funeral. He watched in stunned silence as the casket was lowered into the ground, his name etched into the polished surface of the gravestone beside it. Jacob Warren. The dates of his life, now carved in stone, declared his time on earth had come to an end. And it had ended weeks ago. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was dead. He hadn't survived the accident, whatever it had been. The life he had clung to, the routine that had felt so real, had already slipped away, and this train, this endless, haunting ride, was his afterlife. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, watching helplessly as his family wept. He wanted to scream, to shout out to them, to tell them he was still here. But the words lodged in his throat. No sound came out. They couldn't hear him. They couldn't see him. He was already gone. The train rumbled past the platform, and the funeral slowly disappeared from view, swallowed by the darkness once more. Jacob slumped back into his seat, his chest tight with grief and disbelief. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't ready for this. How had he ended up on this train, bound for some unknown destination, surrounded by the faces of people he had lost? Tears blurred his vision as the weight of it all pressed down on him. His life, everything he had known, everything he had built, was over, gone. And now, all that was left was this endless journey, with no clear end in sight. As the train gained speed again, Jacob felt a sharp, overwhelming sense of loss. The faces around him, the passengers who had once been part of his life, were silent witnesses to his fate. Alex, Mrs. Holloway, Paul, they were here because they, too, were part of this limbo. And now Jacob was one of them. The whispers returned, softer now, but more insistent. They swirled around him, wrapping him in their cold embrace. His pulse quickened as he glanced at the passengers again, their faces ghostly and still, their eyes staring ahead into nothingness. They were waiting for the train to reach its destination. But what was that destination? And how long would it take? Jacob gripped the armrests of his seat, his knuckles white. He had to find a way off. He had to stop this. The train began to slow once more, and Jacob felt a flicker of hope, despite everything. Maybe this would be the stop where he could leave. Maybe there was a way out. He stood, his legs shaky, and made his way toward the doors again. His eyes darted around the carriage, searching for something, anything, that might signal a way to escape. But as the train pulled into the next station, the doors slid open, and a cold wave of despair washed over him. Another group of passengers boarded, their faces dull and lifeless, just like the others. They moved like shadows, slipping into their seats in eerie silence. Jacob watched, his heart sinking. He had been wrong. There was no escape. This wasn't a stop where he could leave. It was another step deeper into whatever purgatory this train represented. The realization hit him like a hammer. This train wasn't taking him anywhere. It was simply keeping him trapped, moving in an endless loop, a cycle of guilt, regret, and unresolved memories. Jacob staggered back to his seat, feeling defeated. The weight of his fate pressed down on him like a lead blanket. He would never leave. He would never see his family again, never have the chance to make amends, to fix the mistakes he had made in life. He glanced out the window one last time, but the funeral was gone. All that remained was the blur of darkness beyond the glass. The train doors closed with a soft hiss, and the carriage began to move once more. The passengers sat still, their faces unreadable. Jacob closed his eyes, trying to block it all out, but the whispers persisted. They weren't angry or malicious, just a constant reminder of the reality he couldn't escape. He was part of the train now, just like the others. Jacob slumped in his seat, his hands falling limply into his lap. The train sped on, deeper into the night, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels filling the air. There was no destination, only the endless ride. The train hurtled forward, its mechanical rhythm steady and unchanging. Jacob sat motionless, his mind dull, overwhelmed by the enormity of his fate. He stared blankly out of the window, watching the black void stretch endlessly beyond the glass. Time had lost its meaning. The train moved, and he moved with it. But there was no sense of forward progress, just the endless motion, the endless ride. He no longer knew how long he had been on this journey. Hours? Days? It all blended together in the same suffocating loop. Each station the train passed through seemed the same as the last, each one empty, devoid of life, and indifferent to his presence. Each stop brought new passengers, more souls from the past, their faces increasingly distant and hollow. He recognized some, others were strangers, but all shared the same vacant expressions, as though they too had resigned themselves to this limbo. Jacob slumped back in his seat, the whispers around him now a constant companion. They were quieter now, less urgent, as if the voices had given up trying to reach him. They murmured in the background, an almost soothing hum in the oppressive silence of the carriage. It should have unnerved him, but the fear had faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. His eyes flicked toward the door at the far end of the carriage. He had tried, so many times, to escape. He had moved from car to car, searching for some exit, some way off this train. But every door led him deeper into the same endless tunnel. The train never stopped for him. It only kept moving, bringing more passengers, all bound for nowhere. He felt the train begin to slow again, the familiar screech of the brakes cutting through the air. Another station, another pointless stop. Jacob didn't move. There was no point. His gaze remained fixed on the floor as the doors slid open, the cold night air briefly rushing in. Then he heard footsteps. Someone was boarding the train. Jacob barely glanced up, expecting to see another pale, ghostly figure settling into a seat nearby. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped directly in front of him. He looked up. A new passenger stood before him. A man, perhaps in his 30s, wearing a worn leather jacket and carrying a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His face was pale, but unlike the other passengers, there was a glimmer of life in his eyes. He looked nervous, confused, his eyes darting around the carriage as if he were unsure where he had ended up. Jacob blinked, his heart skipping a beat. The man wasn't like the others. He wasn't part of the endless stream of the dead, drifting silently through the train. He was new, alive. The man looked down at Jacob, uncertainty written across his face. Is this the train too? His voice trailed off as his eyes fell on the other passengers. His brow furrowed, his confusion deepening. What is this place? Jacob stared at him, the words stuck in his throat. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He had been in the man's place once, unsure, terrified, desperate to understand what was happening. But that was long ago, before the truth had sunk in, before he had become part of the train itself. The man shifted uncomfortably, his eyes now scanning the carriage with growing unease. I don't think I'm supposed to be here." Jacob opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His throat felt dry, his thoughts sluggish. What could he possibly say to this man? Could he warn him? Could he explain that the train had no destination, that it would keep moving, forever collecting more passengers in its endless loop? The man took a step back, his confusion turning to fear. "I have to get off," he muttered, more to himself than to Jacob. "This isn't right." Jacob's hand twitched, a surge of something, pity, perhaps, rising within him. But he remained seated, paralyzed by his own resignation. The man's panic deepened as he looked around the carriage again, his eyes wide with the same terror Jacob had once felt. He turned to the doors, but as Jacob knew all too well, they wouldn't open. Not for him. The train lurched forward, its journey resuming. The man banged on the door, frantically pressing the buttons, his breathing ragged. "No, no, no." His voice rose in desperation as the station disappeared into the night, swallowed by the darkness. The man turned back toward Jacob, his eyes pleading. "How do I get off this thing? Please, there has to be a way out." Jacob felt the weight of those words press down on him. He had asked the same question when he first realized the nature of the train. But now he knew the truth. There was no way out. The man's pleas grew more frantic, his hands gripping the seats as he staggered back down the aisle, trying to find some exit, some escape. But the train kept moving, indifferent to his panic, the endless night stretching out before them. Jacob watched, numb. He wanted to help, to say something that might ease the man's terror. But what could he say? What hope could he offer when there was none? The whispers returned, faint at first, then louder, swirling around Jacob's head like a familiar, unwanted companion. He closed his eyes, letting the murmurs wash over him. The cycle had begun again. Another passenger, another soul, trapped in the same limbo. The man would learn soon enough. Jacob leaned his head against the window, staring into the infinite darkness outside. The train rumbled on, deeper into the void, with no end in sight.